Well, certainly good to be with all of you today. Happy for another opportunity that we have to worship together and to study God's Word. Um, in the first lesson today, I'd like to introduce for the next few weeks here a series of lessons on the Song of Solomon. We did an overview of the Bible in a lesson talking about how the Bible is a library and how it's broken down, and I made some quick overview of the book of Song of Solomon, and there were a number of people that mentioned that day that they would like to hear more about that. They'd like to study that story and how it's broken down in that book. It's one of those books that isn't studied very often. I've had opportunity to teach it a couple of times over the last 45 years or whatever, so it doesn't come around very often, so I hope that you will appreciate the lessons and that it'll be of benefit to you, and you'll look at it as an opportunity to study a subject really that we don't get to study very often. It's the story in the Song of Solomon of a woman's search for true love. There is a triangle that, as I understand it, that's talked about in the book between King Solomon and a Shulamite girl from Shunem, a city in northern Israel that takes care of a vineyard. She's caught up in this traveling caravan, I guess, throughout the land of Solomon, where he was constantly picking up every pretty young girl that he saw to be one of his wives. And she evidently is being raised by her brothers that made some kind of deal. She ends up with Solomon, and he's trying to woo her to be one of his wives. But she has a shepherd lover, a boy back home that she's in love with. And you have her choice that's made in the song. So you go back and forth between those two characters, is the way that I come to understand it. And the book of Song of Solomon, of course, there's a lot of discussion when you look in Bible encyclopedias and dictionaries and commentaries about who the author of the book is. I would understand it to be Solomon. He wrote many proverbs and songs, and this was his song of all songs that he wrote in connection with love. It originated evidently sometime early in his reign as king. He, ends up later on having 700 wives and 300 concubines. And when this book was written, it mentioned 60 queens that he had. So it seems to be early on his collection process that he was going through. He was certainly an avid songwriter. We're told in 1 Kings 4 and verse 29, "Now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind like the sand that is on the seashore." So a brilliant person and a great writer of wisdom in 1 Kings 4:32, and he also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005 that had come down. So he was a great writer, but this song, it says, is the song of all the songs that he wrote. It's thought to have been written maybe between 965, 960 BC. I always think about the United Kingdom is right around the year 1000, sort of as a round number, where you have Solomon for 40 years, then David for 40 years. And we can see in Psalm 6 and verse 8, there are 60 queens and 80 concubines and maidens without number that were a part of his household and his harem. And these young girls are often trying to have an influence on the Shulammite girl to join Solomon and join them in the harem there. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 3 through 4, we see how it turned out in the end with Solomon entering into all of these marriages and marriage contracts with other kingdoms round about by marrying the daughters of various kings of the surrounding countries. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For it came about when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. So we know in this book and throughout the Old Testament that polygamy was something that was tolerated by God, but it was not something he approved of. It wasn't his original design. It was in the beginning, Adam and Eve, one man with one woman for life was the plan of God. Jesus, of course, in the New Testament takes us back to that original law. It says that's the way that God intended it from the beginning that we should practice. And so throughout just the history that's recorded, we find out all of the negatives about polygamy and all of the trouble that the different kings had and different people had and rivalries within a family that happened. And we see it turned out no good for Solomon either. With all of his wisdom, the influence of his wives in his old age that he'd married from these foreign countries had caused him to compromise and build some temples and altars for his wives to worship other gods. The book is titled The Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, the best and most exquisite of the songs, I guess, that Solomon wrote. And we often, of course, in our English Bibles have the title, The Song of Solomon. Canticles is the name that a lot of times you'll read that comes from the Latin, that a lot of different scholars talk about it. A canticle is a love song, or it's a series of love songs, is the way that some people have taught the book of Song of Solomon, lyrical songs. And again, I think it's a drama that is set forth in the book, but that is one position that's taken on it. The first verse of the book says, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon. So you can see where you can call it either. It's Solomon's Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs that he wrote. And let's look at the setting of the song. You have peaceful times during the reign of Solomon. You remember that he had peace in his day. God gave him power over his enemies, so there was a peaceful 40 years that Solomon had to reign, and that's certainly reflected in the book. He's traveling around from place to place. There's not any talk about war. He seems to be super wealthy and powerful and so on as it's presented in the book. And that golden age of David and Solomon seems to be the period of time that is reflected in the book. There is a Shulammite. She's mentioned where she came from in chapter 6 and verse 13. And Shunem is in northern Israel, in the area that belonged to the tribe of Issachar. And again, she lives a rural life. When she talks about her lover and he talks to her in the book, it's always with all of these country terms that they use to describe one another's good qualities and beauty. On where Solomon, when he talks about it, it's horses and in the city, that you hear about, and those kind of things. So Issachar, this Shunem, a number of different places in the scriptures, and this young girl is from there. There's a unique character to the book. Of course, it's not like any of the other books that we read in the New Testament. It's one of the most misunderstood and debated about books when you get to reading the history of different interpretations of the book and so on that go back to ancient times. It was written 3,000 years ago in an old culture, half a world away from us. So we can understand that some of the cultural things, you have to do some study about Eastern customs and so on, and the way that they spoke and their type of love poems and so on that they used. And archaeologists in recent years have found many of these from surrounding countries that show this was a form of their literature that they had at that time. But there's a lot of confusion that has come down. The Shulammite is described as a tower, talking about gold, eyes like doves, cheeks are like pomegranates, and her hair is like goats. And you put all of that together, we might bear in mind that it's not giving you a physical description, but just certain qualities of those different animals. So say your hair looks like goats, running down a hill. I don't know that that'd be the biggest compliment today, but her hair was black. It was thick, like a goat's hair, I guess. And so that was a compliment that's given to her. Her eyes are like doves behind her veil. Her lips are like ewes that have come up from bathing and are white. and there's not any of them missing. She's not missing any teeth, which I guess in ancient times that would have been something more common without modern dentistry, that people would say, and she's got all her teeth. That's a good compliment. And her neck is like a tower of David. Well, it's strong and it's well built and something to be decorated, like that tower was with shields and so on. But anyway, it has language that is a little different than what we ordinarily use in our speech. There are different speakers and speeches that are given as you go through the book. And the only way you can, it's not labeled, although in some ancient manuscripts in the Greek Old Testament, they did say, the king or the bride or whatever it'll say. In some of our Bibles, it'll have that in our translations. But the thing that they have to go by is just the pronouns that are being used. Sometimes it's a male that's talking, and then there's other verses where it's a female that's talking, and then there's verses where there's a chorus that is, it's plural, that are speaking. So I'll hand out maybe next week an outline of the book as we go along, that you can kind of see which speaker's speaking where. At least the best outline that I was able to come up with. The unique character of the book, there's no other book that emphasizes human love in the way that the Song of Solomon does between a man and a woman. And that is certainly a major part of our lives, and the Bible was written to help us in all different phases of our life. It'd be kind of unusual if there wasn't some kind of a book like that out of the 66 books of the Bible that didn't address this important aspect of our relationships and our blessings under the sun that we have, that Ecclesiastes talks about. What's one of the good things that Solomon said that you have under the sun, that you're able to share your life with a mate and be able to find the satisfaction and love that there is there in that partnership you have in life, is one of those things that is a blessing under the sun. It only has one direct reference to God in the book, and that's in chapter 8 and verse 6, talking about the power of love, true love. No mention of sin or religion or the law of Moses that is talked about in the book. It's not alluded to or quoted in the New Testament. So it is a little unique in all of those ways. Some look back just at some of the history of interpretation of this song. There's a lot of people look at it as, over the years, have looked at it as an analogy or an anthology of love songs. Like we said, a collection of love songs that are all put together. Some scholars, they like to go in and divide everything up. It's sort of what they write their doctorate on or whatever, to come up with a new division of stuff. So I saw one said there was 31 different songs in this one song. It all seems to have a unity to it, to me, when you read it. It seems to be one story that's being told, not 31 different songs all put together. There's a allegory is what was taught in Judaism, what is in the Mishnah and some of the commentaries that were written by some of the ancient rabbis, that they, instead of talking about a love story between the human beings, they want to elevate it and make it more important in the sense that it's all talking about God loving Israel and Israel loving God, and they spiritualize everything in the book. And a lot of the, in Catholicism, a lot of the people in the Middle Ages and so on, that was the approach that they took. Everything was spiritualized, and the problem with that is it's sort of just whatever you can make up in your mind that you think it represents. It's not it's very hard to have any rules to figure out. It was talking about Christ loving the church and the church loving Christ, and that's what it's about. But it seems to be, to me, literal, that it is a literal book, and it's talking about real people. And there's spiritual lessons that are taught, important lessons about true love and how to choose a mate and what kind of priorities to have for your life and so on, and who you're going to spend your life with. I think that is what you find in the book. Certainly it could be typical in some ways that it, in illustrating what true love is, that certainly is reflected in the love that Christ has for the church and the church ought to have for Christ. and so on. But you start off, I think, as a rule, really, in studying any book, you try to take it in its original context and its real situation, and then you try to draw the principles from that. You don't start off with saying, well, what does it mean to me? What did it mean when it was first written? That's what you want to look at. So some people take it, a lot of people teach it as just two characters. You just have a song going back and forth between Solomon and this girl he's going to marry, and that it's just those two people. The other view is, the one that we'll take in this, is that there's three characters, and the Shulammite and Solomon and the shepherd. And there are many conservative scholars over the years that have taken that approach. A man by the name of Ewald, that was a great German scholar in the early 1800s, took that view. And then that became kind of by the time the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia that was written back in the early 1900s was written, that was the leading view at that time, that there were three characters. There was the shepherd lover, is Homer Haley. That's the position that he taught at Abilene and at Florida College in the Old Testament studies there. So I've looked at his notes. Someone that I went through a kind of a preacher training program was Lowell Williams, that taught in Kirkland, Washington, and that was the view that he took of it. When you go to Pat Field's online class materials and stuff, you can download that workbook, and it takes this same view. So, I mean, it's a widely taught. I know a couple of years ago at Seminole, or at 84th Street, I visited on a Wednesday night, and Harry Osborne was teaching the book there, and he was taking the basic outline that I'm going to follow too. So it is something widely taught, this idea of three characters. So it turns out to be a fascinating love story between a young girl and a shepherd and King Solomon. The poem is God's commendation of true mating love and his condemnation of Solomon's polygamy. And I think that, if that is true, that is an important point to get across. So there's three principal leads that are in the story. There's some other characters, the women of the court or the harem, that are also in the story, and her brothers are talked about, what they say. Says the Bible is a complete book. It does deal with all the different aspects of human experience. Mating love, of course, is a strong factor in our lives. And if it's not talked about here, then it's not, we really don't have a book on that. The very structure gives you some evidence as it goes back and forth and changes the pronouns and all of that, that it is a drama that is written out in song that is given to you. And you have virtuous girls. It says if all it is the marriage of a virtuous girl to Solomon, if that's the theme, then Solomon's polygamy would, you would think, kind of be tacitly at least endorsed by a book. But instead, I think it's a book where Solomon, this is the one that got away. It's what the book is about. The one that didn't join the group, and what her motivations were for not becoming part of Solomon's household. But she wants the shepherd. She wants the life in the country. She wants that original idea of marriage with one person out there instead of being with Solomon. In spite of all of his power and wealth and having the easy life with him, she would rather be there with her own vineyard and her own sheep and her own place that she can live. So these three principal characters, you have Solomon tries to charm the Shulammite away from her shepherd with his money and power and flattery. He really focuses on her physical appearance. There's several different proposals that he makes. It's like she's been taken to the palace, sort of like Esther was, you know, in that period of preparation. And he's trying to convince her to go ahead and go through with the marriage during that period. And all of the other women there trying to build Solomon up as the one that she should choose. But she's had this boy back home that she's always been in love with and intended to marry. That's just a simple shepherd, but that's who's in her mind and that she thinks about. So she's tempted by all these outward trappings, which of course you would be, I would suppose, but her heart remains loyal to the one true love that she wants to return to. And the poem addresses the triumph of that love over lust and money and position. So you have some secondary characters there, the shepherd and the king and the brothers, and again, the Shulammite woman. Solomon's appeal to her. The song from the most polygamous king ever, and more, he's in the Book of World Records, I guess, with the most wives there's ever been, a king. He had more money than anybody. In his day, silver wasn't even considered precious. They had so much gold in the time of Solomon that, and yet it seems to be, even he recognizes the quality of this young girl, that she chooses to go home. She goes back to the country. She's not going to stay with the king. And out of all the women he ever met, she seems to have impressed him enough, he wrote this song. And he doesn't come off looking all that great in the song. But, in the book of Ecclesiastes, doesn't he do the same thing? He tells you about all the things he tried that turned out to be vanity, and he tells you about what your life should really be about, is to serve God and keep his commandments. That's what it ought to be about. And the simple pleasures of life. So Solomon shows himself to be the loser when it comes to love. So you got all the money and all of the power, and you could choose anybody and get all of the people that you want in your family, but he doesn't have anybody that he can really count on. In chapter 8 and verse 7, it says, many waters cannot quench love. We're talking about true love. Nor will rivers overflow it. If a man were to give all the riches of his house for love, it would be utterly despised. When you got true love, it can't be bought off, right? And that's one of the things that the Shulamite shows. All of the money, the power, the prestige, and all of that. She wants her shepherd. She wants him. She doesn't want all of that. And Solomon tries. In chapter 7 of Ecclesiastes, look what Solomon said about the people he knew in his family and in his court and so on. And it says, which I am still seeking. He was looking for a good man, but have not found. I have found one man among 1,000, but I have not found a woman among all these. So he's just talking about the low quality of people's character and so on. He says, one man in 1,000 really is the type of person he ought to be. And I says, I look around the women, I don't find any. So in that kind of sad, you have 1,000 wives, and he can't find one in 1,000 that he really looks up to or thinks of. So this girl must have been a 1 in a million, right? That she would turn him down and go back to her shepherd. So that is certainly a possible theme there that we can see. One thing you should look at as you go through the book is that she is a morally pure girl. There are all kinds of figures about her love and what she's thinking in her mind and how she'd like to be with her shepherd and so on. But she as a person is sexually pure. And that's emphasized by Solomon. It's emphasized by the shepherd. And she says it about herself. So you shouldn't read that into any of the verses that you read. They're all talking about what you would have once you have the person, once you get married, if it has a sexual content to it. Solomon says, but my dove, my perfect one, is unique. She is her mother's only daughter. She is the pure child of one who bore her. So she is pure. The shepherd, when he's speaking to her in her dreams and so on, says, a garden locked is my sister, my bride, a rock garden locked and a spring sealed up. So she is not a loose girl at all. She's a virgin and has kept herself that. And when she describes herself, they have a riddle at the wedding at the end of the book where she would get together with the shepherd finally. And just like, at the wedding of Samson, that they had the riddle about the eater and so forth that was told. Well, there's a little riddle here about, we've got another little sister besides her. And what should we do with her? And she says, we have a little sister, and she has no breast. What shall we do for our sister on the day when she is spoken for? When some boy comes and wants to take her, what do we do? And wants to get betrothed to her or get engaged to her. And this is what she answers. She says, if she is a wall, we will build on her battlements of silver. But if she is a door, we will barricade her with planks of cedar. Now, if she has self-control, she can guard her virtue, then, and she's a wall, she doesn't let anybody have access to her before the proper time, then you can give her freedom, and she can have all of this battlements and so on built upon her. But if she is somebody that's easily naive and give in to persuasion and so on, she's a door and gives easy access. He says then you need to keep her under guard, right, is what should be done in her case. And what does the Shulammite say about herself? It says, I was a wall. So that's the type of person that I was. I was a wall, and my breasts were like towers. And then I became in his eyes as one who finds peace. So she, throughout the book, is talked about as a pure person. So that should be understood. Some of the verses that have been misinterpreted as if she's talking about sexual activity or whatever is chapter 3 and verse 1. Says, on my bed night after night I sought him whom my soul loves. Well, I don't think you have to take that in a smutty way, that she thinks about her shepherd and wants to be with him, and I think that's a very natural thing. In the King James Version on 113, it says, a bundle of myrrh is my beloved unto me. He shall lie all night betwixt my breast. In the New American Standard Version and the more modern translations, they point out it's the bag of myrrh that lays between her breasts. It's not the shepherd. It says, my beloved is to me a pouch of myrrh which lies all night between my breasts. They would wear this, you think about perfume now. They could put sweet-smelling spices and things in a bag and carry them to try to keep away the odors, and everything that are around and to smell good. So that's what it's talking about in the verse. That's just an example of some of the things that have been misunderstood. The Oriental view of love. Of course, some people, I guess in the Victorian age and during the Middle Ages and so on, have the idea that any kind of passion and sexual love and so on is associated with the body, and the body is inherently evil and so on. It was a part of Greek philosophy that you find in a lot of the teaching in Catholicism also. This idea that there's something unclean somehow or another, that you'd get married. It's better to be celibate and to be like the monks or whatever. That's the way that you be. So they don't want to give any talk to the physical pleasures of life that you have in marriage and sexual relations and so on. But the Bible, the Eastern people, they didn't look at it that way. That's not the way the book of Proverbs talks about it. Look at Proverbs 5 and verses 15 through 20. Instead of going out and being with some loose woman and commit adultery or whatever, you have your own wife and your own source of satisfaction, your own fountain that you get your satisfaction from. Drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your spring be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets? Let them be yours alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain, talking about his wife, be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth. As a loving hind and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. For why should you, my son, be exhilarated with an adulteress and embrace the bosom of a foreigner? So you can see they spoke plainly about these things in the book of Proverbs. And you see Solomon, suggesting, sexual conquest that he's going to have if she'll marry him. Says, your stature is like a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I said, I will climb the palm tree. I will take hold of its fruit stalks. Oh, may your breasts be like clusters of the vine, and the fragrance of your breath like apples. Part of his efforts to woo her. So human sexuality is something that God has created. It is something that's honorable within the bonds of marriage, where it should be. It is something that's pure. And we're told about Adam and Eve, and Adam knowing his wife, we're told in Hebrews 13:4 that let marriage be honorable among all, and the marriage bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge. Right? So marriage and sex in marriage is an honorable thing, is what the Hebrew writer tells us that we should think. In the Zondervan's Bible Encyclopedia, it says, although the poetic imagery are almost completely alien to modern taste, the composition is never lewd or obscene, even by the standards of Western civilization. In fact, the conicals reflect the traditional canons of sexual morality contained in the Mosaic Law and never countenance anything which could be described on such a basis as immorality. It reflects the traditions of Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, where it talks about she's bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, and they become one flesh. And its discussion of the whole range of emotion of lovers is conducted at a high level of sensitivity and morality. The purity and beauty of human love as a divine gift is the dominant theme of the book. So that's the description of what's talked about in the Song of Solomon. Another writer on the book said the notion that Christianity views the body as evil and sex as nasty is traceable to the religious folks who have mistakenly advanced such ideas and not to the Bible itself. The Bible has a very positive view of sexuality. It speaks candidly of the sexual nature of God's human creatures. Of course, we can see that again in like 1 Corinthians 7. We need to get married lest we be tempted to fornication, and that your body is not your own, but your mate's, and so on. It's talked about. The Song of Solomon encourages the cultivation of an exclusive and unconquerable attachment of two people to each other within legitimate marriage. It endorses physical love within this setting and makes sensuality and infidelity appear hateful. So those are some things to bear in mind. Another verse that I think is mistranslated in the King James Version, which is actually a verse that gives you the theme of the book, is chapter 2 and verse 7. And it's repeated in chapter 3 and verse 5, and then I think it's repeated similarly later on in the book. She's talking to the women of the court that are trying to persuade her to be with Solomon. It says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and by the hinds of the field, that you will not arouse or awaken my love until, and it should be translated, I think, it. You don't awaken love until it pleases. You don't force people into love. The animals, they have their mating rituals and so on they go through, right? It doesn't happen just immediately. And she says the same way with me. Don't try to force me to be with Solomon. That's not what I want to do. You can see in the Revised Standard Version, the New King James Version, the New Revised Standard Version, the English Standard Version, the Bible in Basic English, Green's literal translation, and just on and on and on, they have it there. Don't awaken love before it's time. That's the proper pronoun that they all say, and I would agree with that. So eventually the girl's going to end up choosing this poor country shepherd. And they have a love that's like a fire of God that you can't put out. And it talks about what true love is in chapter 8 and verse 6. For love is as strong as death. Jealousy is severe as Sheol. It flashes like flashes of fire, the very flame of the Lord. Many waters cannot quench love, nor will rivers overflow it. If a man were to give all the riches of his house for love, it would be utterly despised. So I think we're out of time, so I'll stop there, and we'll take up with the outline and go through chapter 1 down to chapter 3 and verse 5, Lord willing, next time. Appreciate your attention. If you'll bow with me, we'll be dismissed to our Bible classes.